This is Ricky Gantz with G220 Ministries, and this is a response to the Watchmen for Israel in Cleveland. I had an interaction with them, posted a video, showed that interaction, and there was two things that I wanted to address. And in this one here, I want to speak about Matthew chapter 24, because one of the questions that I had posed and asked Jeremiah of the Watchmen for Israel Hebrew Israelite group, I asked them, was Jesus a false prophet when he makes the claim in Matthew 24:34 that this generation will not pass until these things take place? And so I want to look at that real quick here in Matthew 24 and just kind of explain a little bit of where I was trying to come from, and didn't have a lot of time to interact with them. But hopefully through this video, they'll be able to see where I was coming from and maybe respond to that. So when you look at Matthew 24, this is the destruction of the temple. We're gonna hear Christ lay this out. Now, as you see in the beginning here, the first verse, it speaks about how he's leaving the temple. Jesus left the temple and was going away when the disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these things, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will be not thrown down." So all these stones are going to be thrown down. There's not going to be one standing here. And so they, of course, ask, and they want to know what this is about, and they want to figure out what are these signs of these times. And so they ask him. He sat on the mountain, and the disciples came and privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming?" Now, I want to point out a few things because I don't want to go into a long, detailed exegesis of this whole passage. But what we see here is they come and ask him to tell them about these signs. So he starts to go through. He sees in verse 6 here, he says, "You will hear of rumors of wars." And then he talks about there will be famines and earthquakes. He says, "They will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death." Now, I want you to take an important understanding of these things. In verse 6, it says, "And you will hear." He's speaking to them. He's not saying future generations will hear about these wars and rumors of wars that take place. He says specifically to them, "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars." And then he goes on here and he says, "And then they will deliver you." These are the disciples and who he's speaking to, that first generation, that first audience hearing this thing. We can't discredit that. It's too often when we come to exegete passages, we discredit those things. But he says, "You up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake." And so he's speaking to his disciples at that time. He says, "Many will fall away, betray one another, and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and lead many astray." And then he says here in verse 14, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world." So this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. And I think that's very key, and it's very important. He says, then the end will come. Paul believes that the gospel was preached to the world, okay? And as I would state, that Matthew 24 is prophesying here of this destruction of the temple, which we're seeing, and that did take place in 70 AD. And so when we look at some of these other passages here, we go to Colossians. Paul's writing here to Colossians, the church in Colossae, and it says, "Because of the hope laid up for you in heaven, of this you have heard before in the word of the truth, the gospel," speaking of the gospel, "which has come to you, and indeed in the whole world it is bearing fruit and increasing." So Paul's telling the church of Colossae here that this gospel is going out and bearing fruit in the whole world. The whole world has heard this. And when we speak of whole world here, what we have to understand is it is referring to the known world at that time. So the gospel did go out to the known world. We see it when Christ ascends back up into heaven after his resurrection. He tells them to go preach the gospel. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to him. Go preach the gospel to Jerusalem, to Judea, and then to the ends of the earth. And they go and they do this before 70 AD. The known world was hearing the gospel. Colossians 1:23 here. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven. And here that creation is referring to every creature under heaven. So again, the whole world going out, hearing the gospel, the known world at that time, Paul's telling us it's been proclaimed. Here in Romans chapter 1, verse 8, first I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is proclaimed in all the world. Romans 10, verses 17 and 18, so faith comes by hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. But I ask, have they not heard? Indeed they have, for their voice has gone out to all the earth, and the words to the end of the world. Their words to the end of the world. And then finally here, 1 Thessalonians 1:8, for not only has the word of the Lord sounded forth from you in Macedonia and Achaia, but your faith in God has gone forth everywhere, so that we need not say anything. So my point here is that this, referring to the world hearing this gospel, and then the end will come, and that is what Paul is declaring to us happened to the known world at that time. The gospel was going forth all over the place in the known world. And then, so getting back to Matthew 24 here. So they speak of, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And then I highlight here, and alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. The reason I do that is because in that interaction that I had with WFI in Cleveland, one of the things that was stated was that when I brought up Luke 21 as a parallel passage, they said, no, that's not a parallel passage. But it is a parallel passage. It's referring to the same thing, and I want you to see this. It's destruction of the temple. It's being foretold. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know the desolation has come. Because I said the surrounding of Jerusalem is the abomination of desolation. They said, no, that's not. This is a parallel passage, because it goes on and says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let those who are out of the country enter it. For these days are the days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. Alas, for the women who are pregnant and those who are nursing in those days. And then it goes on even to say, I want to give you more parallel here to Matthew 24, and this being a parallel passage here in Luke. It says, and there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and the earth, and on the earth distress of nations in perplexity, because of the roaring of the sea and the waves. And they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power and great glory. So again, I want to show that this is parallel, because they said it didn't. But I want to show you here that it comes down here. It says immediately after the tribulation of those days. It's just continuing what was being stated there in Matthew 24. And again, you can read this and get a better grasp of the context there. I'm just wanting to point out some highlights here and try to make this a quick response that they can then maybe see and then respond to as well. It says immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens be shaken, and the Son of Man coming on the clouds with power and great glory. And then what I had brought up there was, so also when you see these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass until all these things take place. And this is referring, all these things that have already been laid out here in Matthew 24 are taking place. This is referring to judgment, God's judgment upon the covenant breakers, Israel. Israel is the covenant breakers. They were the ones who went and stoned the prophets. They're the ones that he calls, if you go back to chapter 21 and then 23, before you even get to chapter 24, this is where Christ is referring to these covenant breakers as these brood of vipers, this wicked generation that kills the prophets. And so this is what that is referring to there, and I hope that that is helpful for you to understand and grasp And I hope that they will be able to respond then back to this.